Good morning. I'd like to welcome you to this discussion sponsored by the Edge Foundation in collaboration with the Foundation for Education Development. For those of you that don't know who we are, we're an independent foundation passionate about giving young people the knowledge, skills and behaviours they need to flourish in their future life and work. Today's discussion is important, indeed vital, against the backdrop of constant churn seen in the education sector, with policies and ministers changing rapidly and giving no continuity. The Foundation is keen to help and support policy making and makers, and one of our current pieces of work, Learning from the Past, is designed to provide a record of previous policies in technical and vocational areas, understanding what has worked and importantly what hasn't worked, and importantly why. It is critical that we learn from these so we can then do better by our young people, and regardless of politics, ensure that we offer the highest quality of education policy development so it's fit for purpose for the industry. And to that end, I'm delighted to be joined by a fantastic panel of former permanent secretaries. We're looking forward to hearing from you. I'd like to say thank you to King's College for hosting us today, and to Fed for bringing this event together, and also to the team at Edge, especially Elle Wilson, for their hard work in shaping today's discussion. I'll now hand you over to Branwen Jeffries, who's Education Editor for the BBC News. Branwen, over to you.
Thank you. Well, I'm delighted to be here. One of the things I've experienced as a journalist over 30 years is witnessing the process of ideas being formulated, sometimes becoming policy, being implemented, flourishing, and then sometimes being scrapped despite that, failing and nonetheless being revived. It's remarkable how cyclical some ideas are. We have a consensus around many of the long-term chronic issues in education, but all too often the short political cycle means that we don't have a consensus around building long-term thinking and solutions, which is why we're here today with a fantastic panel of 3 former permanent secretaries from the department, Sir David Normington, Baron Bichard, Michael Bichard, and Jonathan Slater, who's the most recent incumbent and whose time has overlapped, and now as a journalist he's able to be in the same room as me as a permanent secretary, which is great because we want to draw on their wisdom and their insight and their experience about what works and how we can use that to take it into the future. So I think a good start to the discussion would be to just ask you each in turn, starting with you, Sir David, just to very briefly give an idea of a policy which, when you look back at your time in education, you think was a success, but also one that perhaps sank without trace.
Will we come up with the same one? Is
No,
what I'm
I've checked that, and no, we won't. Though I agree with yours as well, because we did overlap. Of course, the ones that failed, I don't really remember. But
Try harder.
we were warned about choosing one that was a success, and the one I chose was London Challenge, which I don't take any personal credit for, but I was permanent secretary in 2003 when it was launched, and I believe it contributed to completely transforming secondary education in London, and it had many of the things that make for good policy, which is it was based on best practice at the time. It was a mixture of a national objective with extra funding and advice and support, but it was essentially a local initiative working with schools and groups of schools, and it changed the landscape. It's a very evaluated programme, and it's very difficult to be quite sure what it was that changed education in London. I personally believe it was as much about the leadership that programme represented and the drive and ambition it represented, which everybody got behind. They said it was not possible to change education standards in London or in big capital cities, but actually we proved them wrong. and London is now one of the leading education successes in the country.
Was there something about the tight focus of the objectives that helped that, and a place-based approach?
I think both those things. I think also the consistency with which it was pursued. It did continue until it was, I think it was wound up round about 2011, 2012. We might talk about why governments wind up successful programmes, but it wasn't a Conservative programme, it was a Labour programme, so there'd be something of the politics in that. But I think it was focus, I think it was place-based, I think it worked with successful local schools that formed partnerships with less successful schools, so you're using the resources of the education system to improve the education system, and it was longer term. Well, I can think of a failure if you want. It was decided that we'd introduce performance pay for teachers, and that was an absolute disaster, except that it put a lot of extra money into teachers' pockets. The Treasury didn't like it. The only reason the Treasury was willing to fund extra pay, and this is back in, I suppose, 2000, was because it was going to be distributed on a performance basis. But guess what? Everybody got it. And that tells you something about the difficulty of assessing performance in schools. And I think it was a mistake to attach pay to it. Sometimes you need to learn from things that don't work. If you have, I'm not saying you should always have the whole teaching profession on your side when you pursue reform. I don't think that's possible. But having the whole teaching profession, including the leadership, against you is a bad idea.
Yes, as I think probably several politicians have found. I mean, very pertinent today because of the ongoing discussions about public sector pay. Michael Bichard, can I ask you to do the same, to reflect on something that was successful and something that you look back and why they worked or didn't work?
Before I say which one I chose, because I told you that, picking up on what you said, one I would have probably chosen, which wasn't when I was permanent secretary, was the introduction of total place. When I was asked by Yvette Cooper to, at the time of the financial crisis, to come up with some ideas of ways in which we could use the public resource more efficiently and more effectively. It seemed to me that there was just no cooperation across national, central government with the voluntary sector, local authorities. And so we came up with the idea of total place. It took off dramatically. Within a few months, there were 102 local authority or local areas carrying out a form of total place. And picking up your points, it was ended in 2010 by the new coalition government, who decided it was too close to the Labour Party. And instead of total place was introduced a watered down troubled families programme, which Louise ran, and ever since I think government has been trying to find a way of getting back to place-based policy and delivery without calling it total place. So I would have used that, but I'm not going to. I'm going to use Sure Start, and I'm going to use Sure Start again, not because I was responsible for it. Actually, one of the reasons I'm going to use that as an example is I wasn't responsible for it, but I think it's a really good example of a policy which has had impact down the years. And once again, what we've seen is a political battle over an initiative which was successful, but which people didn't want the other party to be able to claim credit for. The second reason I chose it is because it was a really good example of interdepartmental activity, the like of which we've not seen much of in Whitehall down the years. It was actually began in the Treasury with Norman Glass, who I'd worked with before. It was developed and delivered, sometimes it felt over Gordon Brown's dead body, within DFE and DWP. And as I say, it had a long-term impact, and that's pretty important for a policy. But, as I say, once again, I think fell down because it was too successful in a way.
Although family hubs, some people
oh yes, absolutely. I mean, family hubs
are
is just a reinvention of Sure Start.
Of many
I know
of the
that,
principles.
yeah. But will they actually be delivered? Will they be delivered?
And we already had Sure Start until it was
Well, we'll get
dismantled.
on to the cyclical nature, but perhaps. Something that didn't go so well.
Oh, no, that's much easier. I've got a long list of those things. I think I take personal responsibility for a disaster called Learning and Skills Council. And it was a disaster. And the lesson to be drawn from that is never think that you can change policy or behaviour by structural reform, which you can't. I mean, at the time we had training enterprise councils, which you'll remember, at war with FE colleges, and it just seemed it couldn't get any worse. So learning and skills councils were suggested, and it did get worse. And I think that was a mistake. And do you also remember the learning entitlements, which the lifelong learning, I don't know what we called it at the time. And that's an example of a bad policy where...
Individual learning.
That's right, individual learning accounts,
Yeah.
where we were fighting for the money to make those work, to be able to put money into risk management and fraud prevention. We didn't get the money, and they were a complete failure. Since when they have been reinvented, not just in the UK, but go and have a look at what's going on in Singapore at the moment. And it's just another example, I think.
And again, they're kind of, that concept of a lifelong entitlement to allow you to keep on educating is back again. Jonathan Slater, can I ask you for your highs and lows, and what was it that made them work, the success work?
I had no lows. It was just one day's fun after another. I should start by saying thank you very much to both David and Michael. I've got a 14-year-old daughter who's at a fantastically good London school, and it is indeed, of course, the case that schools in London got much better as a consequence of the partnership between local government and the DFE that David referred to. And also, before she went to school, she was at one of many brilliant children's centres that were set up under the Sure Start programme. Great to see the stuff actually on the ground. I was lucky enough to work for 4 Secretaries of State in 4.5 years. Nicky Morgan, Justine Greening, Damien Hines and Sir Gavin. And one of those 4 had got a sort of vision. I mean, I don't say there's a criticism of the other 3. You've got to feel sympathetic to Secretary of State, particularly if they only get a year and they get no notice and they're in, they go. But Justine had got a vision for what she wanted to do. She described herself as a working class girl from Rotherham who'd made it. That's what she said at her first all-staff event. And she said 30 years later it's a lot harder. That's what she felt. She said it would have been a lot harder for working class kids to make it than it had been, and so she was driven by an ambition for social mobility, and she was, that was, and and that's what she wanted the department to focus on. And if you've got a Secretary of State with a clear ambition, you can drive. And we didn't drive for long because she wasn't in post for long. But actually, the thing which people remember, and is still in place actually from her time, surprise, it's a place-based initiative, opportunity areas. It was much smaller scale because there wasn't a whole of government effort behind it, and because she wasn't in place for long. But in areas of the country most deprived, people coming together, very much in the way that Michael described, very much in the way they did in London, looking at the particular challenges that children face in Blackpool or Scarborough or whichever the area is, and what can we do to improve it. So nothing on the scale of David and Michael, but I guess interesting that a sort of a positive thing that was done was in the same sort of space.
And a low?
Oh, a low. Well, so, I mean, obviously, we could talk forever about what a tremendous success the exams regime was. But leave that to the inquiry. It's about to start. I'm happy to discuss it if you like. But what I found when I was the permanent secretary of the Department of Education, I hadn't really expected to find this, but it's true that I did spend an awful lot of time trying to stop things happening. I used to watch, Yes Minister before I was a civil servant, and I was outraged, by these, by the sort of the caricature of a permanent secretary who sort of trying to stop ministers getting things done. And then I sort of found myself in government. So, after about a month or so, I'd inherited this plan for sort of compulsory academisation of all schools by a particular deadline, and there was no way it was going to work. And so, I had to do the thing that permanent secretaries do, to bring that to an end as quickly as possible. A thing that was up and running was a good attempt to try and persuade some teachers, good teachers to work in parts of the country where there aren't enough of them. You know, that is obviously a serious problem. And so there was a payment on offer, and it had been piloted. Good. You know, that was a good thing the DFE did. Let's pilot it, see if it works first. And it was failing because, you know, it turns out the 10 grand isn't enough to get somebody to uproot and go to another part of the country. And so we closed it down really quickly. And I was given some grief at the Public Accounts Committee. You know, this is a failure. And I said, what are you talking about? This is great. This is policy making working, right? We piloted it, didn't work, we stopped it.
So I can say, you know, this is the other bit of policy making, isn't it? Which is deciding timescale, whether it's going to work, whether it's feasible, because you also intervened around T levels and the timescale that was being set for that. Is that an example where it's a policy which has potential, but actually speed and political haste could end up compromising it?
So there's always a tension, and that's a good thing, between, you know, ministers who want to get it done today and civil servants who they're, you know, it's a bit more complicated than that. And, you know, you want some creative tension between the two. You know, you want ministers to be pushing us harder. You know, obviously, not just because they are expecting to be out of a job in a year, but, you know, you want them to be ambitious and driving, and you want us to be saying, well, hang on a minute, you want that sort of tension, don't you? And normally that just gets resolved. But there is this, you know, there is this thing called managing public money, which gives a particular responsibility on permanent secretaries to put up a red flag if they think that they're being asked to do something which just isn't going to work, either poor value for money or since 2010. So actually, you know, since your time, they changed. Nick McPherson changed the rules so that if the permanent secretary felt that there's significant doubt as to the feasibility of the plan, as to whether it could be done on time, a significant doubt, then you had to seek a direction from ministers, in which they could still do it, but it's now their risk, not yours. And so I said, hang on a minute, I'm being asked to introduce these technical qualifications, which everybody thinks is a good idea, faster than Michael Gove reformed GCSEs, right? And Michael Gove was a man in a hurry, and GCSEs already existed. I was being asked to do something that didn't exist, and I wanted another year. You know, and Theresa May didn't want me to have another year, which is fine, absolutely fine. And so I sought a direction. I was quite proud of it, because it's not a thing which you know, it's a bit tense if you say to the Prime Minister, you know, we're going to put in public that you think this can be done faster than me. And when I look back at, you know, which had been done in the previous 7 years since the regime had come in, I discovered there hadn't been any, which I guess gives you a sense of, you know, why it is tense. Or maybe I was the only permanent secretary asked anything problematic in that time.
So we're already seeing some themes emerging here, that focus, piloting, a place-based approach, collaborative working. Michael Bichard, you were drawing on your experience in local as well as national government to sort of make that point about getting things to join up. These are things that can really help, and what gets in the way is often a fixation with structural changes of organisations and also the political cycle. Who owns the ideas? We'll come back to some of those, but I want to start by asking you all, where do you think good policy making begins? How much of that is about having a very healthy, informed public debate around what the problems are? How much of it is about having a very florid sort of ecosystem in academia and other organisations of ideas which are evidence-based, which then feed into the political process? David Normington, do you want to start?
Well, I do think one needs a very lively debate and a lively debate of ideas, but that is not going to be enough. I mean, I think that for there to be good policy, it needs to be something that has been debated and challenged. I think it's well documented that when policy goes wrong, it's sometimes the result of a groupthink, which can be a political groupthink, which is we all think the same, so it must be right, and you need to test policy very hard. It's desirable to pilot it if you can. One of the difficulties of piloting it, if you're going to then universalise it, is it's a quite different matter to take a policy that's been successful in a few places and then make it a national system. That is a very difficult thing.
And you experienced that with the London Challenge. I mean,
They tried to take it to other places. It didn't work so well. But what I was going to, the one key message about policy is not a beautiful thing to be debated in rooms like this and taken out of the cabinet to be looked at from time to time. It has to be an implementable, a deliverable thing. And you need to spend as much time in policy development on how it is going to be delivered on the ground and what the likely levels of support and resistance are going to be to it. And if you don't do that, you greatly reduce the chances of the policy functioning. So deliverability. It doesn't mean, as I said earlier, that you have to get everybody on your side. If you're doing something challenging, if you're doing something that is forward thinking, there will be people who will want to resist it. But you need to have enough people with you. And key people, if you're talking about schools, are school leaders. One of the things we did a lot in the period that Michael and then I were permanent secretaries, we invested very heavily in school leadership. We worked very hard with what was then the Secondary Heads Association, the National Association of Head Teachers. Didn't always agree with them, but we had a lot of support for the core policies from the head teachers. And if you have the leadership on your side, you have a better chance of succeeding. So, because people think that government's very powerful, but in education, you have to take your policies out to 25,000 schools, and now innumerable academy trusts. To I don't know how many teachers there are now. I've lost track, but lots. And your levers in central government are quite limited. There's legislation, there's funding, there's inspection, there's advice, there are league tables. You're always looking for the things that will ensure that your policies are delivered on the ground. And I come back to it, you have to have the leaders of the education system with you to a degree, otherwise your chances of it actually having an impact everywhere are low.
So deep engagement, exploring the ideas, using that to then inform the delivery plan and the implementation timescale.
And if possible, co-developing it with people in the education system. Not always possible, but that is the ideal. It's true in any policy development. Whitehall really doesn't know best. Mind you, sometimes we thought we did when I was there. But the co-development of policy with the people who know.
The point you make about the levers of government has become very apparent over the last 20 years with much more fractured systems, particularly now with the school system. And we're seeing at the moment, in some ways, an attempt with the schools bill to tie all of that back together to get to a system where maybe there is more central control. How important is that, is being able to exercise the will of the policy across the system, Michael Bichard, to making good policy work?
I think it's overstated. I mean, we have a very centralised system of government generally, and we think that we can control most things that are going on out there, and the reality is that we can't. And the more time we seek trying to develop systems to enable us to do that, I think the more time we waste. I've always thought, it has to be said, I've always thought the academy system would end up exactly where the government now seems to want to take it. You get rid of local authority, you have lots of individual schools, and then you bring them back together and control them from the centre. I mean, we'll just go around in these kind of circles. That wasn't the question I was asked to answer, however, so shall I answer the question you're asking to answer? One of the questions I was asked to answer is, why is this discussion important? And well, obviously, because a lot of people can want to talk about it, but it's actually important because we don't talk very often in this country about the quality of policy development within departments. And I chaired the NEO for some time. I remember, actually before I was chair, trying to get the NEO, when we were in the department, to do some work on the quality of policy making in different departments. They can't look at individual policies, but they could look at policy development. What's the extent of policy analysis? How are they using data? How are they managing risk? You know, to what extent are they involving external knowledge and experience? So I don't think we talk very much about what makes good policy, which is the second question you asked us to address. And because we worked together for 6 years, you won't be surprised that we have some similar views. Evidence-based,
Boring as death.
evidence-based, yes, to a point. So I did get to the stage where I was threatening to throw things at anyone who came through my door and said, what we need is evidence-based policy, because it's become a cliche. And there is a point beyond which, you cannot go any further, and those of you who are involved in education research will know that there is no agreement about what the evidence tells us. So you have to make a judgment. This is not a science we're talking about here. You've got to make judgments, and at some point you've got to say, right, well, I think we've got as much as we're going to get, and we've got to make a decision on what we're going to do. I think that across government, not just in DFE, that there isn't enough involvement of lived experience, which is another way of describing some of the things you were talking about, David. We make policy in all sorts of areas. We don't involve people early enough. We don't give them real clout in the process. I mean, I'm a great believer in co-design. It's a bit of jargon, I know, but I worked with the chair of the Design Council for some time, and it made it clear to me that one of the big missing pieces of the jigsaw in central government is they don't know how to design policy or delivery systems. So you've got to give lived experience involvement, not just through consultation and participation, which is often managed terribly. I mean, when I sat on the secondary legislation select committee in the House of Lords, we kept getting stuff that, the DFE, I'm sure not for your time, but the DFE were sending out consultation papers amazingly 3 days before the summer holidays and giving people 7 weeks to respond. Well, that's not the kind of involvement that I'm talking about. You've got to involve lived experience, voluntary sector, local authorities, teachers, head teachers too. One or two of the things you didn't mention, but I know you agree with, I think you need to consider how you're going to deliver this policy. Is it deliverable? I mean, some policy, frankly, is just not deliverable. I did run the benefit system for some time. I had to fight my way to the policy table to say to people, this will not work. The social fund is a dead policy, and we need to do something about it. It's got to be deliverable. You've got to integrate management information. I'm sorry, it's boring, but you've got to integrate it at the time you make the policy so that you know whether this is working or not. New Deal was a really good example of that working well. Going back to my benefit days, disability living allowance was a total disaster.
I'm going to bring Jonathan Slater in at this point, because you've talked about that disconnect between policy formulation in Whitehall and what's actually happening in the system. And I'd like to ask you to reflect on that. But it also strikes me that one of the big things that's changed across your collective experience is perhaps the capacity within Whitehall. And I wonder if you feel there's enough invested in terms of that pulling in of external challenge, particularly around education.
So, I mean, as David and Michael have said, it would sort of seem obvious, wouldn't it, that the best policy for schools would involve starting in the classroom. Starting in the classroom. In fact, every Secretary of State always says, and there is quite a lot of evidence that backs them up on this, that the best way to improve schools is to have really good teachers, really good heads. And then it's surprising, having said that, how quite often how limited the sort of policy agenda is to actually helping teachers do their jobs better. Because it's hard. I mean, structural reorganisation is easy. You can create a new organisation pretty easily, can't you? But actually improving the quality of teaching, helping teachers do that's a lot harder, isn't it? The reason why the DFE is at risk of being more disconnected from the front line, from teachers, than in other departments is because teachers aren't civil servants. By the way, I'm not recommending that they should be. We're already far too centralised an education system, as Michael has said. But that does mean that teachers don't have to be in the room. In DWP, the people running the job centres are in the room when the Secretary of State is deciding on a new policy, and they're going to say, hang on a minute, it's going to fail, right? But teachers don't have that by right. Now, under both David and Michael, a lot of senior leaders in the profession were given the opportunity to be part of the conversation, and all the better for it. But the period post 2010 is sort of well known for teachers being described collectively as the blob. a lot of the architecture that had been put in place being closed down in the bonfire of the Quangos. David talked about investment in school leadership. You know, there was a wonderful college in Nottingham which did a lot of that, and that was closed down.
And that is infuriating.
We did set that up.
Yeah, we did.
But on the other hand, it was sort of deliberate. I mean, this is deliberate. It seems to me that, and it sounds like the same is true for Michael and for David, that the best policy in our world is a partnership between teachers and government. But that is not a good description of the last 30 years. I mean, there have been times in which it's done, and David and Michael have both talked about that, but ever since Callaghan's speech, it's not good enough. And then the introduction of a national curriculum, telling teachers what to teach, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it has been, with some exceptions, when Estelle Morris was your minister, as an ex-teacher herself, there was much more alignment, but generally, I would say, ministers don't really think of themselves as the allies of teachers. They're the ones who are going to sort of tell them how to do their job better. And the language that I inherited, not from either of you, both of you had gone, from the 2010 to 2015 period, was we talked about hard-edged accountability. It was always hard. Hard-edged accountability? Why not just accountability, right? It's a sort of fantastically tough regime. And I think that is not really conducive to a partnership between the people who actually got to help these kids day in, day out, and the ministers are going to be around for a short period of time.
And accountability is great for everyone else except for you. Not for you, but I mean for...
David Normington, you want to come in?
Well, I do want to come in because I think a bit of history is important here. By the mid-1990s, the education system was failing the country. Its standards were too low. There were too many failing schools. There were too many schools, particularly secondary schools, that were okay but had lowish ambitions. There were local authorities who were still responsible for education, some of whom had lost the reforming zeal which the great reformers in local government had had once. And we're not in that position now, I don't believe, despite all the ups and downs we've had. And that's a result of something happening that's been for the good. And we're very poor. We had this conversation before we started about learning from some of those experiences. It was important in the 1990s, and fortunately that was picked up by the Labour government at the time. Actually, they built on some of the things that the Conservatives had started doing. It was important to provide a real impetus for school improvement. And some of that had to be done, I'm afraid, against the education system. I don't go with calling the teachers the blob, or indeed the education establishment the blob, but there are people there who are resistant to change, and sometimes you have to get the coalition together that will make that change happen. I think that is what happened in the 1990s. I'm quite proud to have been part of it. It's just by chance that I was part of it, and I think a lot of improvement stemmed from there. We're in a different period, but we need to learn from some of that. And if I may just say about investing in teachers, one of the very, very first things that I did for the government of the day in 1999 was prepare the Teachers' Green Paper, which was all about investment in teachers. I don't know whether you remember, Michael, the conversation we had around an away day with David Plunkett was all about how we invested in the teaching profession to make sure that it could actually achieve the ambitions the government had for improving standards. And a lot of that has been lost, but for 10, 15 years that Green Paper was the roadmap for investing in teachers, for investing in school leadership. Yes, it had this National College for School Leadership in it. It also had lots of other stuff. And yes, you can do it with teachers, but you have to invest in them too.
What's remarkable, listening to you about this investment in the workforce, which is the core of any system, is that if you look at other public services, that is owned professionally and separately from the policy making and political process. And what is it about education that has taken that into such a different domain and stopped long-term thinking about planning for how many teachers we need, what kind of teachers, how do we learn from the successes and failures, as Jonathan Slater described, of trying to work out what we need to get good teachers into very challenging communities. Why is it so difficult to get that long-term vision in education?
I'm sure there's a view. I'm not quite sure I know the complete answer, but this is the one subject that we all have a view about. We all go to school, hopefully.
But we all use the NHS.
Yes, we do, but it's not quite the same. Hopefully, most of us don't use the NHS from one year end to the next. Maybe we should, but most of us, all of us, have been to school, and a lot of us then have children or grandchildren who go to school. Everybody has a view of education, and everybody wants it to be better now. You need it to be better for your child now, not in 20 years' time. So there's this constant pull between short-term initiatives, because this does matter to politicians. They have to be re-elected. There's this constant pull between the short-term need to prove to the electorate that you're addressing the problems now, and the real need, which is to have a 20-year vision for improvement. You have to be on both those tracks, and I think governments have a lot of difficulty with that.
I think there's another reason. I agree absolutely with that. Indeed, I stopped going out to dinner, because if you go out to dinner, you sit next to a governor or a parent.
You should be in the Home Office.
Yes.
That makes it even worse. You
I think
stop
trust.
going anywhere.
I think lack of trust, which has grown up over a very long time, lack of trust between different parts of the education system is a reason why there is so much animosity and.
Yes.
So what will it take, just turning your thoughts to the reason we're here, which is to draw on these lessons, to take away some ideas about what would allow the formulation of a long-term set of policies for education, and to allow parties to do what David Normington, you were describing, one political party recognising the merits and what had been started and taking it on, which has happened actually again with the changes of government with the academies.
Yeah.
So what are the key elements that need to be put in place to allow more of that to happen and a longer term approach?
Branwen, I'm not going to answer that question initially. There's one thing we haven't talked about very much at all, which makes me feel uncomfortable, and that is equality, inclusivity. Because one of my answers to what should we be doing in policy is we should be having a policy which is proofed against discrimination, which is actually aiding social mobility and equality. Your London Challenge absolutely did that. As a former London Chief Executive, let me tell you, that was absolutely fantastic, and I never thought I'd see it happen. But by and large, one of the problems, as Justine said, is that it's probably more difficult now as a working class kid, which is what I was, than it was 20 years ago, let alone if you're a black Afro-Caribbean boy in certain parts of the country or an Asian kid in other parts of the country. And I don't think we've done enough explicitly to address that as we develop policy, and we haven't involved those communities sufficiently in the development of policy, and that worries me. And one of the things I tried to do at the NEO, I think towards the end of my time we were doing it better, was to make sure that every NEO study had an equality dimension to it. Because if you're producing policies which actually are not being accessed by large parts of your community, it's bad policy.
So on this question about a long term, what could be done, it is in the nature, obviously, of the parliamentary system in this country, first past the post rather than PR. It doesn't see compromise, it's binary. And with the increasing centralisation of education, as David said, there's a perfectly strong argument that said that the system needed to be driven. But the consequence of that is that an enormous amount of power is held by a very small number of people, and when there's a change of government, That's what happens in such a system, isn't it? On the other hand, interestingly, I wonder when people say that the problem with schools is that there's an insufficiently long-term approach, is that what they really mean? I mean, New Labour was in charge for 13 years, right? And was driving a pretty consistent direction for that period of time. That was not chopping and changing. It started with some particular targets and drove on and on and on and on. And then, as has already been referred to, Michael Gove picked up the academies programme, did something somewhat different with it. But the value add system that had been invented for school league tables was driven on and on and on. And then for the last 12 years, we've had one government, really. Nick Gibb, the schools minister for most of that time. Very, very consistent agenda from Nick Gibb. 10 years of it, right? So it's not so much, is it, that teachers can say the political direction is changing all the time? I mean, they could sort of say it happened in 2010, but on the other hand, it is a democracy.
Well, I think it's sometimes the tinkering with it.
Yes.
Some of the underlying objectives are the same. It's the tinkering, it's the changing.
So there's
names.
tinkering, and certainly with 4 secretary of state in 4 years, absolutely, and we're going to agree with that. But the sort of general direction, I think the concern of the profession is that they don't really like it. They don't really like it. They don't. I mean, my daughter's just about managed to get out of doing one particular GCSE, and the reason that was such a tough argument with her head teacher is because Nick Gibb thought she should do it for a system that was invented, by 1988 by Ken Baker, who's very frustrated that the current ministers are using the powers they've got to define the curriculum. And I said to Ken, when he would lobby me about it, well, it was your idea. So I understand, David, absolutely the argument for that sort of drive, and there've been lots of benefits of it. But if you do give enormous amount of power to individual ministers, which is the system, then it is inevitably the case that they're going to use it. And so for me, and I obviously would say this as an ex-director of education and as the son of a teacher, if you want a more long-term approach, decentralise.
I want
David
to
Normington.
completely agree with Jonathan. I do want to just come back on this. What happened under the Blair government was that you can't go on driving things from the centre, and this became more and more apparent. Literacy and numeracy strategies are a very good example of something that was immensely successful
of
and
diminishing returns.
Yes, and they run out of steam, but also because of what I said about the nature of the education system, you have to try to make improvement and reform self-sustaining. And actually, this supports your point, Jonathan. Somewhere in about 2003, 4, 5, when I was still in the education department, the debate was very live on what are we going to do now we have driven all these improvements. How are they going to be self-sustaining? And a lot of what has happened since then has been trying to answer that question. So you take away the power of the local authorities, and then you wonder what you're going to put in their place if you're not going to drive it from government. And the answer was to have a very decentralised system with academies having lots of autonomy. And then we thought, gosh, there are all these academies.
We need regional schools commissioners.
We need commissioners, and then, gosh, we'll need to form them into something. I remember in 2005. This is dropping a name. Going with Secretary of State Ruth Kelly was one of the many Secretaries of State to Chequers, and having a debate on this subject with Tony Blair about what we were going to do. And one of the debates was, should we get secondary schools into trusts? And a good idea, actually. We didn't do it straight away, but there was a debate going on, and I think in a way it's still going on, about how do you help the system to keep moving forward? Where do you strike the balance between the national leadership, of which there has to be something, and the local sustainability of it? And in a sense, I think that is the key debate for long-term policy, because otherwise you will have national governments popping up every year or two with a new national agenda, a new national plan of some sort.
And yet it feels as though we go through cycles of structural reform in public services in which, layers like a regional layer that is a size that maybe is coherent and works, it is created, abolished, and then recreated again.
When I arrived in 2016, that's right, 2016, with the plan to turn every school into academies, I asked, how is this system supposed to work? Yeah, how is, what is the, and how is it going to be managed, right? Because there are about 6,000 academies. About 1,000 have got one school in them. How is the system supposed to work, right? And what was the plan? You'd be surprised at the number of people who quoted Mao, which I wasn't really expecting of DfE civil servants. And there was this notion of sort of creative destruction, 1,000 flowers blooming and all that, Well, Dominic Cummings writes a lot of interesting things. Literally, I think, no thought had been given. I mean, genuinely, and I think deliberately, to how this system was supposed to work. And it doesn't work, right? It simply doesn't work. So the frustrating thing for ministers today is they've got all this power, but actually it's much, much harder for them to use it, right? If you want to get 1 million laptops into the hands of children tomorrow, right? In the old days, David would have told me how many I needed to give to the children of Islington because I was the director of education, I would have given them. But that system does not exist anymore, and they're trying to create something in place of it, and goodness me.
We live in a world where short-termism is really important for a politician because of people like you. Deliver in 2 years, or you're not going to be back here. So there is a real focus upon short-termism. And the only point I'd add to what both of you have said, we haven't really talked about regulation in this discussion. I mean, Tony Blair's, I love working with Tony, fantastic Prime Minister. His understanding of education, having been a public school boy, was perhaps a little underdeveloped. And that's why he thought you just needed to impose targets and regulation. And we were the poor people who were going along and saying, you cannot improve the education system just through increasing the number of inspectors. So there's this force from people who don't fully understand the system. There's this determination, we've got to deliver something in the next 2 to 3 years, which is why you get learning and skills councils and structural change. And it just keeps going on.
And is that churn why sight is lost of what you were describing as one of the sort of fundamentals, which is the inequalities which hold back the education system, that long tail? But
we shouldn't just think, I know we're the education correspondent, we shouldn't just think this is an education issue. You see, we don't step back on other services. The reason I said about health you should be is that health is an incident-based crisis service. Its investment in prevention and early intervention is disastrously low because it doesn't step back. No one steps back and says, why was the pandemic such a disaster for black communities, people with obesity and diabetes, and could we have done anything about it before? Of course we could have done. We could have invested in preventing those things. It's a thing right across government. And there's also right across government an increasing distrust of political leadership. And if you distrust the political leadership, you're going to attack the policies that come out from that political leadership.
And a more fractious relationship between civil servants and politicians?
Yeah.
Jonathan Slater?
Well,
all of you, but
generally no. Generally, over my 20 years as a civil servant, I worked obviously for many ministers in many departments. And I enjoyed it. I would typically get frustrated by civil servants criticising politicians. I would go along to the induction meetings and I would say, what are you doing in the DfE then? Right? It's not compulsory to be a civil servant. The civil service is the only organisation at national level in which you're working for politicians. You've got to like them or go work at Sainsbury's, so I like politicians, and obviously Dominic Cummings was an unusual sort of a guy, wasn't he? And Boris Johnson is an unusual Prime Minister, and I was one of 7 permanent secretaries who were sort of removed over a pretty short period of time. But that's ended that period. The permanent secretaries aren't being removed these days. Yes, obviously there are particular things going on at the moment, aren't they? But in general, I would say my experience of politicians and civil servants was they worked well together. Can I try just one other comment on this issue of how to improve schools and this national local thing. I think, again, if you go back to the class, if you say what matters is what goes on in the classroom and how to help the children, particularly those who need help, as we all know, if you were to ask a teacher today, what they would most like, it's not more guidance on teaching, it's, more social workers, yeah? It's access to better health care for all those children with special educational needs. There's a very large number of children who are just not really engaging at all. But 20% of children are not going to school. Are not going to school at the moment. I mean, not every single day, over 20% are not going to school every single day. Right, so and that is something that central government is extremely ill-equipped to deal with. The central government can drive a literacy hour, a numeracy hour, to make sure that that teachers teach one thing. But then, if you're trying to instead to think about the whole child and organise a whole variety of services around those children who need them the most to enable them to succeed, that is much better organised locally.
And that's why
by local government and not by central government.
And that's why local government is so important, and why many local councils have reinvented themselves exactly in that way. And they still have a role in education, which is very important for that reason.
Absolutely.
And on the fractious relationships, I don't think any of us, mainly, but with an exception or two, had a difficult relationship with our ministers. And indeed, it's your job not to.
Absolutely right.
Your job is to work with them to help them be a success, and because if they're a success, you're a success, and to work on in a very positive way. And that's my experience. I can count on 3 fingers, actually, ministers who I didn't get on with in my 37 years. If I add 5 years after I'd left government, I can add 4. Ministers, but generally the relationships are constructive and positive.
I mean,
Aren't they? And
more than that, I think it's exciting. I mean, people say, well, you're very lucky because you had David Blunkett, who's known to be a pussycat. Well, let me tell you, you're not. Nor was Steve Byers, nor was Charles Clarke. Estelle Morris was quietly robust, and you've got to find a way of working with these people. And actually, if you can do that, and we haven't mentioned special advisors, I think one of the reasons that I enjoyed the time that we worked after 97 onwards was the fact that there was a team approach. People knew what their roles and responsibilities are, but you would actually find it quite difficult if you came into a meeting to know who was a minister, who was a civil servant, and who was a special advisor. Now that's become very fractured. And I think the responsibility of a permanent secretary and a secretary of state is to make sure that doesn't happen. So far as possible, this has got to be a team focused on the outcomes.
I'm keeping an eye on the time for all of us, and I think now is a good moment to ask, would anyone like to pick up on any of the many themes that have come out of our discussions so far to ask a question to our fantastic panel? Go ahead.
Hi, Normington Sixth Form College Association. There's something about not just how DfE works with the rest of the education sector, but how it works with the rest of government, in that we're always being asked to fix issues that are actually really health issues. So, you think of the mental health crisis at the moment and all the additional funding and training that we're trying to secure for mental health support in schools and colleges. Or you think about the need for massive numbers of industry placements for T-levels to be a success. That's partly an issue with the economy and the businesses rather than something the DfE can fix. Do you think there's sort of blue sky thinking? Is there any way for DfE to be a bit more, to have more power within government, to ask other departments to work with it on shared priorities? Like we always talk about how the PM has a veto, the Treasury has a veto, the Health Secretary to some extent has a veto, because saying that will destroy the NHS is kind of a death knell to any policy. The Education Secretary doesn't necessarily have that kind of veto. Is there anything that we can do to strengthen their hand?
So I think there are 2 elements within that, is the weight that the DfE can carry within government to assert priorities, but also cross-departmental working. And actually on mental health, Jonathan Slater, some work has been done very recently over the last few years, between the two departments to try and get a support system in place for schools. Was that in recognition of this kind of overload of other priorities that we're hearing about?
Well, I think there has been, isn't there, an increasing recognition over the last 10 years that there is a really serious mental health problem right across the country, and it starts when you're young, and that's the royal family has played an active part in pushing that message, and it's generally understood to be something which has got to be addressed. And so there's consensus across government. So the Secretary of State for Education and the Secretary of State for Health both thought this was an important priority. And there was a decent effort when I was there, and I'm sure it's still the case now, for people to collaborate across departmental boundaries to work on it, albeit in very constrained financial circumstances. So nothing like the speed of investment that ideally people would want. But I think that where there is agreement at the government level, cabinet level, that something is important, people will work reasonably well together. Where it's one Secretary of State trying to impose his or her will on the others, it generally won't work. Only the Prime Minister and the Chancellor have got that sort of power. If you really want people to collaborate, again, it's much easier doing that at local level than at central government level, just because central government is so big.
Michael Bichard, would you agree with that?
It happens sometimes, but it's not the instinctive reaction of departments, I must go out and find a friend and partner and deal with something like mental health, because the whole system is incentivising people to work in silos. I mean, you don't become the Prime Minister because you've actually been brilliant at building partnerships with some other department. It's much better to be able to point to the fact your department that you run is now 30% bigger than it was. And to be fair, I don't think we did enough in terms of working with, say, DCMS as it is now, or other departments. But the system just doesn't encourage that, and it's a great, great shame.
I mean, basically, you're talking about something that is a problem about the way government works. I heard on the Today programme this morning the Chief Inspector of Constabulary talking about the need for the police to have more support from mental health professionals. So this is an issue across our system and across the country. I thought Michael had part of the answer to it, which is if national government's not going to join up so well, then it has to be done locally, and it's important that the silos, which there are in government, don't come down into silos locally. They do sometimes, but your best chance of addressing your problems is if local people, and in this case local government, convenes local partners to address those issues. I don't think there's any other solution to that, and national government recognising that and resourcing it is what is needed. As for the Secretary of State for Education, well, they come and go in importance, don't they? And it's sometimes, you go out into the street, see if you can name the Education Secretary, will tell you whether they have any clout or not. And some of the recent ones, no one can remember, can they, unfortunately, because they've changed, not for good reason. Honestly, and there were lots of mistakes in the period that we were in government. If the Prime Minister says, education are my three priorities, and I'm going to appoint somebody who is a significant player to be Secretary of State for Education, then they will have more clout. If the Prime Minister doesn't show any interest in education and appoints somebody who's good but not outstanding, then they won't have.
There's a slight elephant in the room here, because we haven't mentioned the fact that for most of the time that we worked together, there wasn't a Department for Education, it was Department for Education and Employment.
Or children and family.
And skills.
Yeah, okay, but as far as education and employment is concerned, we probably didn't achieve as much as we would have liked to have achieved in terms of getting industry and business and education working together, which they've never done very effectively. But I think we were beginning to make a start. The disruption that was caused by taking the employment side away, and actually also taking universities with it, that was actually one of the reasons I left. Simply because you can't go around for 4 years telling your staff that this is the best thing since sliced bread to have a DFEE, and then go around afterwards saying, well, I never really believed that. So now it's back to the old DFE, and isn't that wonderful?
Skills.
And that,
we called it skills for a while.
But you can't do that.
I'm going to see this.
I just want to say one thing, which is one good example. In 2003, the Secretary of State for Health came to us and said, I think children's social services should be transferred to the Education Department. He wasn't forced to do it. Mind you, he was leaving. It was Alan Milburn. But actually it was a statement about how sometimes you need to put things together at national level. I think that was a very positive step. I'm not sure enough has been made of it, but it's still there.
Question.
Morning. Neil Bates, I'm chairman of the Edge Foundation, and spent 5 years of my career as a FE leader in education and skills. Been on the receiving end of numerous policy initiatives over the years. In fact, Edge has just published what we're calling a honourable history of reform in education and skills. We were going to call it horrible histories, but we've decided to call it honourable histories. But it documents huge changes in policy and structures particularly within FE. Well, I've got perhaps a more fundamental question is, I wonder to what extent within the department there is discussion about what education is for and who it's for, as opposed to the latest policy or the latest structure. Because it seems to me that if education is about anything, it's about the impact it can have on the life chances of the people that experience it, whenever they experience it, as adults and as young people. And if you were to evaluate our education system, I suspect that we would come up with a system which is overly focused on an academic outcome, overly focused on 50% of young people that progress on into further and higher education, and leaves behind large numbers of young people, white working class boys, looked after children, who are failed by our education system. When we live in a global world where education and skills are so critical.
So I'm going to take that question, and I could hear you agreeing, Michael Bichard. Do we insufficiently ask the question, what is education for and who should it be serving most? And is that...
Well, the answer to that's got to be no, although I think we spent quite a lot of time. I was actually incredibly fortunate to have I'm not just saying this because you're here, an amazing team. And that was a debate that we had very often, although, of course, we had to be brought back to the reality of producing something which was going to be popular with our ministers, not least. So I think you do ask the question. For me, we could trade definitions. For me, it's about ensuring that every person can realise their potential. And that is why I keep coming back to this issue about equity and inclusivity, because I don't think there's anything worse you can do in life than to deny people the chance to fulfil their potential. And yet that's what we do still in this country. And I think one of the depressing things about this stimulating and wonderful discussion is that we could have had it 20 years ago, we could have had it 30 years ago. We still haven't got to grips with the issues about vocational qualifications. We still haven't got to a healthy balance between business and education. We still haven't produced a society that really commits to lifelong learning. All of these things were right at the top of our policy agenda in '96, but they're still there. It's an appalling...
David Normington, you want to add something?
He was always more optimistic.
But I completely agree with your point. I had made a note, actually, because you're going to ask us at the end of something else about our 20-year vision, if there's time. The thing that has not been addressed in all our lifetimes, and certainly our careers, is this issue of the parity of esteem, as it's sometimes called, between vocational and academic, and technical and academic qualifications. And it is the great failing of education policy over... when T-levels were introduced, I sighed, really. Not because I think it's such a bad idea, but because I thought, oh no, you know, we were talking about that in 2010, 25, 21 and so on. And along with that, I'm not just saying it because you raised it, because the note I'd made is the way in which further education has been treated in all this period, when it is one of the main engines of vocational and technical education, but also often is the place where people who have been failed by the rest of the system are picked up and supported late, it must be said.
Which is why it's been under-resourced.
Indeed, so that is the great, for me, it's the great failing of education policy, the failure to have a settled policy for vocational and technical education and to invest in further education. We tried, but for all the reasons we've been talking about, it's always second, third, fourth, fifth priority. It's always schools and universities in my time that took the airtime. That was always what took the political focus, and it partly reflected the experiences of the politicians who were leading it. Not David Normington, interestingly, but even the drive was for schools.
So let's move on to wrap up, and we have a short amount of time to do this, but on what would be your prescription, your 2 or 3 things that you would like to see? So David Normington, you've already said that a better long-term focus on further education, on technical and vocational education.
The term I use, which is a little bit out of date now, but it's the term we use, which is the parity of esteem point, so that the opportunity point you make is that everybody is helped to find their opportunity, and we don't look down on any part of the education system or any of the ways in which people might progress in life or in work. And if there's one thing to solve, it is that. And a small anecdote: when civil servants are gathering in an election to say what we're going to say to the incoming government, in 2001, when I was very new and I assembled my team, we decided that the one thing we would say was that. And we did. And, well, look where we are. We haven't really done
20 years, 20 years later.
Because there's always been something more important to do. The other 2 things I have on my list is, and Michael has already talked about Sure Start, one of the absolutely central ways of addressing educational disadvantage is to invest in the 0 to 5-year-olds, and it is one of the most shameful things that's happened, the dismantling of Sure Start. It makes me more angry than anything else. Because it wasn't a perfect policy, but there's lots of evaluation of it, and it could have been a perfect policy if we'd stuck with it. And it was partly about resources, wasn't it? So I would invest as a priority in further education, of course, but actually in the 0 to 5s. I think that is an absolute key. We know that disadvantage starts at birth, and the gap widens and is already a problem by the time you get to age 5.
And you had one more priority.
And the third one is, and this is the general one, of course I want every family to have access near to them to a high-performing secondary school, so that no one has to move to find a school and no one needs to go into private education, so that all but the best private schools wither because the competition from the public sector is so good. It can be achieved. It's just the education system doesn't really think it can, but it can be. And if you see what happened in London, of course you'll always have schools dropping down a bit and so on. If you keep that momentum and that drive, that can be achieved.
Great, that's a fantastic list. Now, Michael Bichard.
Yeah, quite. Lifelong learning was at the top of my list. It was a mantra in 1995, 96, 97. We're no nearer to it now than we were then. And what we're now seeing is the only way we seem to be able to give a priority to FE is to set it against HE. I just don't understand why we have to have one or the other, and why we can't actually have a slightly less conflictual policy system. So lifelong learning entitlements would certainly be at the top of my list. I've already mentioned it, but I will, without any apology, come back to it. Continuing inequalities of the system, but in order to give that a slightly different edge, why hasn't the BBC covered the inequalities in the governing system in our schools? I mean, just have a look at the number of black Asian governors in our schools, often in areas.
I think you'll find we have actually, quite recently, but your next point.
Right. That was opening up the discussion very well, I thought. So we need to tackle inequalities at all levels: governors, schools, teachers. Right. The last one you'll think is bizarre, but it's related to the skills thing. I agree with Shawsart. Obviously, I chose that. Why can't we have an advice and guidance system in our schools which actually helps people to make sensible, rational decisions about what they're going to do with the rest of their lives? Why do we have to go on trying to convince the public that there's one in existence when there's nothing like it in existence? You know, just access to IT information is not a guidance and advice system. And the more complex we make skills, FE, HE, the more young people need support, advice and guidance to make choices, and we don't give it to them.
Jonathan Slater.
So when I was Director of Education in Islington, under pressure from the Department of Education, which needed to be applied in the way that David described, we got our act together and helped the schools, secondary schools, get about twice as many kids through GCSEs as had been the case for a few years previously. At the same time, Islington ran a brilliant early years service, and the partnership that I look back on as being the most significant for me as the Director of Education was with the City and Islington College. And so, interestingly, you know, my job was about, in my local area, trying to do the combination of things that you've just been hearing about from David and Michael, and that is much easier to organise with some decent governance at local level, with some challenge, as David says, from the centre. It is possible to imagine a future Prime Minister whose priorities are not just education, 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 but technical education, you know, you could imagine it. At the moment, the Education Department is just a subset of a problem that goes well beyond our borders, which is that in England, you know, for the last 1,000 years, people have thought that what is, you know, the number one skill is to be academic. Yeah? We rejoice in the fact that Cambridge and Oxford are two of the best 3 universities in the world, but only, you know, when defined in a particular sort of way. And I think our obsession with sort of academic excellence, which again is well beyond the Department of Education, is one of the main reasons why England is one of the least productive countries in the OECD. And at some point there will be a politician brave enough to say that, and hopefully there'll be the Prime Minister, and then you make a change. But until then, yes, we did, in answer to your earlier question, have conversations behind closed doors with the ministers not looking about what we would do if we were in charge. But then you get back to the day job.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. I mean, what a rich discussion, and actually a remarkable degree of consensus at the end that, you know, the early years and technical and vocational education, and a focus through both of those, I think, on inequalities, which gets you back to some of the other themes that came through around place and a really focused intervention and sustaining that over a long period of time are part of what works. Thank you very much for joining us today and sharing your insights, and to all of you for being here as well. Thank you.